Okay, so Bryce, I'll allow you, next will be our presentation, which is called The Next Removal Actions at Site 12. Site 12 is better known to some as the residential neighborhood on Naval Station Treasure Island, where a lot of our investigation, a lot of our work has focused and will continue to be focused. And I'd like to introduce you again to Bryce BARTELMA. Bryce is one of our BRYCE project managers. Bryce is in charge of this particular project, which is a good reason for him to be presenting it tonight. I'll be up here with him. And then following the agenda, please hold your questions until the presentation's over. And then there'll be time for the RAB members to ask questions and get answers. And then the community members can come to the podium afterwards and ask questions, and then the Navy will respond. Okay, so without further ado, Bryce, welcome.
Okay, thank you, and hello everyone. As Keith mentioned, I'm Bryce BARTELMA, and I'm the project manager for Site 12 data gap investigation, and then the following removal actions that will occur subsequent to this data collection. Tommy Jean? Oh, there it goes, it's just a little slow. Okay, so I've talked about the data gap a number of times over the last year probably, but just as a reminder for the objectives of doing the data gap.
I'll take that for you.
Oh, thank you.
Concentrate.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
You might be. So we know that there are some chemicals of concern out in the ground at Site 12, some of which get pretty close to some of the buildings, and so we wanted to go out there and collect some samples right adjacent to the buildings, and even some locations where we went underneath some buildings. In addition to that, we recently published a document, the Historical Radiological Assessment, STMs, the Supplemental Technical Memorandum, and in that document we identified what was suspected as a potential rubbish area, and so we went out to do some test pits in that area to sample the soil to see if we could confirm its existence. We also had, so the Navy has a database and we call it NIRIS, and I'm not even really sure what that stands for. The Navy's
Giant
database where we have thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of sample results. And every so often, especially as we continue to prepare documents, we check to make sure its accuracy. And it's actually only 5 locations where we had a duplicate sample result, one of them being not detected and one of them being a detection. And so since we had that discrepancy, we wanted to go back to those locations and resolve it. And so we have some data on that as well. Fourth item, as part of the data gap, was to delineate some contamination around the Gateview arsenic petroleum area. We wanted to collect some data, more recent data, in preparation for removal action. That'll be something we talk about later in the presentation. And lastly, there was some historical detections of benzene and soil gas near Avenue B, and they were pretty low detections right above the screening level, so we wanted to go back to those areas to actually see if there was additional work needed there. So those are our objectives for the data gap, if you wouldn't mind. Here's the locations for the northern half of the site, and it's a little hard to see, but some are highlighted green. Those are the locations that we completed. There's a few that are highlighted in turquoise blue, and those were optional step-out locations that if we needed, we were going to sample. Turns out we didn't need them, so that's why they're highlighted differently. And then on the next slide, it shows the locations in the southern half of Site 12. And this is the Gateview arsenic area. A lot more data being collected there as we prepare for the removal action, as well as a handful of other locations in the southern portion of the site. Okay. Okay, so one of the methods we used for sampling underneath buildings was horizontal drilling. And this is a close-up of the rig. You can see obviously their pipe is going in a horizontal direction. And in the upper right corner you can see how they're set up near to the housing unit, and they're actually able to tunnel horizontally to get beneath the building for collection of a sample. And on the next slide we show what the sample collection device looks like. This is what gets advanced in the boring, and then on the right side there the guy is holding a core of soil from beneath the house. And here's what we found, which was actually no detections in all the locations in the northern half of the site. I've highlighted this one in red because that was one we weren't able to use a horizontal drilling technique because there was too many utilities in the area, and to be safer than sorry, we didn't want to horizontally drill where there was complications with utilities to get there, so we ended up doing that location as a hand auger, which will show up on one of the next couple of slides. Okay? So in addition to horizontal drilling, there are vacant units, of course, throughout Site 12. And so when we wanted to sample beneath one of the vacant units, we just literally went into the unit, and here's a gentleman coring through the flooring, and then we would bring a limited access rig, is what this device is called. You know, basically, you can wheel it in and to drill down to get a core of sediment or soil. We also took that unit into the backyards of some of the residents too. And here's all the sample locations, and again, we only had one detection, which was at this location here in building 1217. Everything else was not detected above the cleanup goals, so that's really good news.
Yeah. And just a little takeaway to put everything into perspective, why are we doing this now? You're noticing here we're focusing here on buildings and vacant units, but all the data he's collecting is actually under a foundation. That's very hard to do, and it was one of the missing pieces of the whole puzzle, if you want to call it that, right, for the neighborhood, as to having chemicals of concern perhaps right up to the foundation that we had data, but we didn't have data under the foundation. And we needed extra data in some cases to really determine what are we going to have to do next, right? And to better define what we have to do next. And that's why we went to all of this trouble after this many years of gathering data to gather this extra piece of data to show both you and to the regulators so that we have a more complete picture of what's going on in Site 12.
Okay. And in addition to the different drilling techniques, we used good old-fashioned hand auger. A guy in a small auger, you can see here that he can literally twist from the ground surface. You guys have probably seen that in the neighborhood before, where they will collect a sample from 1, 2, 3, 4 feet below ground surface that way. And let's go back real quick. I just wanted a quick mention about the radiological screening. It's not just specific to the hand auger. Actually, everything we did as part of the data gap, there was health and safety screening for radiological, and we had absolutely no elevator readings throughout the entire project. Okay, we did get into some of the backyards and front yards of occupied units. That's shown by the stars here. That's how we were collecting the hand augers, and there were no detections above the goals at any of the locations. I highlighted this one in red because if you remember back, that's the horizontal drilling location that we couldn't get, but we got as a hand auger, and there were no detections.
And at that location you were chasing lead?
Lead, yep. Okay. And then in the southern portion of the site, there's just a handful here. I guess 4 of them were non-detect or not detected above the goal. There is the one location there, and that's that open field where in the subsurface there's dioxin above the cleanup goal. So that'll be a location we'll need to go back and remedy in the future. Okay, so this is the Gateview Arsenic Petroleum area. We did a lot of borings in that location. I think it was 13, if I'm not mistaken. And as you can see, we were analyzing for petroleum, and it's this gasoline, diesel, and motor oil. And there is quite a bit, and it's centered around this area of near 1313. So we know we're going to have something to do there in the future, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. And for the rubbish area, this is essentially the outline of where we see it from the historical maps. Gateview Avenue is probably your best way of identifying that. And we did 8 test pits, and for those of you who live here, you may have seen the test pits going on. It'd be a small backhoe and a fence around them, just a 4 by 4 foot hole that they dug. And those are the 8 locations that we tested. This one location, number 6, we moved a little bit to the south because during the utility survey they could actually tell there was some sort of debris in the ground, so they moved that location so that we could try and get, really find if there was anything there. And it turns out in 6 we did find a little bit of something, if we want to go to the next slide. Might be a little hard to see back there, but what we did find is essentially bottles and cans. Coke bottles, water bottles, there was a Menin bottle. This one here is hard to see, but it looks like it's a film reel. Really just some low-density household rubbish that was at about 4 feet below ground surface. And it was found in 2 trenches of the 8, number 6 and number 7.
Right here.
Yeah, that's number
Can you
6.
Yeah, can you just read off that in case they can't see? This is building number 1217, this is building 1228, and
1230.
1230.
So my contractor and I, we did a little research. We're trying to date when this rubbish is from. And one of the best things we found was this Coke bottle, actually. That design was something that comes from about 1915 to 1957. It falls in that gap because starting in 1957, Coca-Cola used what's called applied color labeling. It's essentially the white that they use to write the Coca-Cola. Obviously, as you get later in, they switched to plastic, but back in the day, between 57 and 91, it was a glass bottle with white color labeling. This one is embossed, which just means it was raised glass. In addition to the Coke bottle, we found these White Rock bottles, and I reached out to White Rock themselves, and the best I could do was to find this photo, which showed it from being the 1950s. And then for the Menin bottle, it was a dead ringer for this ad. I mean, it's exactly it, so that's a 1952 ad. So the stuff we found is essentially from the 50s. And as far as all the chemical analysis, and of those 8 trenches, each trench got at least 2 samples, and all of the results were below cleanup goals. There was absolutely nothing of note in any of the trenches, including we screened the soil and the equipment for radiological, and there was nothing on that as well. So we just did identify the household rubbish at about 4 feet in 2 of those 8 trenches. So that's a pretty good story. I mean, there really isn't much of a rubbish area. And then lastly, we did soil vapor sampling. These 2 locations here along Avenue B, that was where we had some historical detections that were right at the screening level, so we wanted to be sure. And it turns out that those concentrations there's nothing there now. It's below the screening level for benzene or actually all the VOCs that we screen as part of that analysis. So that's a great news story as well. So just to sum up all the data gap investigation, for all the chemical sampling we did adjacent or under buildings, there are no chemicals underneath 14 of the 15 buildings we investigated. Really only building 1217 had concentrations of PAHs. And then none of the sample locations we did adjacent to the buildings had chemicals in them, so we know we don't need to go right up to the building in those situations. We're able to reduce the size of that excavation for the future. For the rubbish area, again, it was just low density rubbish and only 2 of the 8. There were no chemicals, no radium in any of the trenches. For the data discrepancies we had, 4 of the 5 of them turned out that they were all non-detects. So there's just 1 location where we actually have to do an excavation. That's that dioxin in that open field. And then for the delineation at the Gateview Arsenic Petroleum area, we confirmed that there's work needed to be done there, and it's primarily centered around those buildings, 1311, 1313. It didn't extend across the street, so we know it's going to be limited to that area. And then again, for the soil gas, there's no confirmed there's no soil gas in those locations currently above any screening criteria, so that's great.